Welcome to session 36 of Classic Metal Class. We're going to talk about something that we've touched on a lot of times, and Scott and I got thinking about it. Well, what does this term actually mean? Something that we grew up with, and some of the other people here also did as well, and that is speed metal, which turns out when you look around to see what other people meant by it, it's not quite as clear cut as we might like. And it was like the new wave of British heavy metal. It's not really a genre as such. Although it has more claim to being that, but it's more of a loose and even contested movement. And there were bands that called themselves speed metal, and we called things speed metal. And I remember like older metalheads introducing us to it. They're like, "Oh man, you got to hear this. This is speed metal," as opposed to like the other stuff that we were listening to at the time. And you could tell there was something there, right? There was something maybe distinctive about it, but you were never quite sure exactly where the boundaries were. And it gets even more complicated because there's definitely overlap with the new wave of British heavy metal. It merges later on very quickly into thrash, also power metal and the first wave of black metal. But we can say that there's like roots going back to the 1970s. So one of our goals here is to try to determine whether there's anything like a single coherent and consistent concept of speed metal, or whether it's a more ambiguous term. And if it's ambiguous, does it have several different legitimate and justifiable usages? So that's, you could call it a metaphysical or a definitional question. It's definitely rooted in music history, but also we could say in applying philosophy. Another goal is to talk about how speed metal originated and where it went and what it fed into. One big traditional answer to it is, well, it became thrash metal, but it looks like the story is more complicated than that. So we want to tell some of that. And then I think, for Scott and I, and also for some of the people attending, I'm going to speak for all of us in saying we're interested in what people, including us, found so compelling and captivating about speed metal. What was it that hooked us in and made us say, "Yeah, this is stuff that I want more of," or I want to hear other bands that are like this. So we've got, a couple overlapping things, some metaphysical and historical, and we could even say aesthetic dimensions here. And I do want to point out there are some bands in the present that still use this term speed metal. And they're framing themselves as part of a tradition, sort of like people talk about the new wave. They're the new wave of traditional heavy metal, right? And so, we could ask the question, are these bands really similar to the bands that we called speed metal, or are they doing something different? So I thought, and this is where we're going to tap Scott a lot, because we're going to talk about like the musical characteristics. Maybe the best place to start is thinking about roughly agreed upon musical characteristics. So when you hear speed metal, I mean, obviously the word speed is in there, right? And you and I were texting back and forth about some bands in the 80s that are doing fast stuff, but we don't usually think of it as speed metal. But speed is an integral part. So, what happens when you speed up a composition that you're normally playing slow, like bands like Judas Priest would play their stuff faster in concert than on the LPs, or what's going on when you like cover a song and you speed it up? I think maybe that's a good place to start.
As far as would that make it speed metal?
No, just like how does that change it musically? Other than obviously it gets faster, right? But what kind of psychological effect does that have, do you think?
Well, I'll start with a good example, and I mentioned this to you and while we were texting about it before. If you take like a ZZ Top tune, old ZZ Top, like
Okay.
before, like the 70s. And there's kind of like a Texas groove to that stuff, right? It's slow. And then you go forward, and then you have Van Halen do Hot for Teacher, which is really sped up ZZ Top. Now, I don't know if that kind of struck us. I mean, you'd have to know about music. At the time, I didn't think, oh, this is ZZ Top on crack. It was, but it's kind of a boogie, right? If you
Yeah,
think
yeah.
about it. So it's got kind of a swing to it. So I had said, if we're going to talk about speeding something up, the first thing that, well, first of all, I'll say, what does it do? It definitely, that song amplified people, like amped us up more, where the slower version of the ZZ Top, it was more of like a slow groove. You were kind of like laying into it. With the Van Halen one, you were kind of not laying into it. You were kind of energized.
Yeah.
And I think that's the same groove, but sped up. I think that's a good way. If anyone's trying to picture it out there, that's a perfect way. If you know, like an old ZZ Top song, and you were to speed it up, you get Hot for Teacher, as one of the examples. And but it's basically, it turns into a fast boogie, because it has, Hot for Teacher has double kick drums. We would say, okay, speed metal has double kick drums. But I think the fact that the tune is a boogie and it kind of swings, has
Yeah.
that like triplet kind of swing, that would discount it. But the feeling would be energized rather than, laying back into a cool groove kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's a good word for it. When we're thinking about what got people into speed metal, the energy of it. They often use the word aggression as well, but it doesn't always have to be like super aggressive. But there's something about that increased tempo, along with the other elements, that is producing kind of a consistent effect.
Yeah. Um, well, I think the straight eighths are one thing.
Okay.
Like, in other words, the boogie is kind of like a swinging eighth note, like dot ba dot ba dot 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 dot, rather than dot 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 dot. The straight eighth note, that's more hammering to me. If I were to use a word, if you heard like,
No.
go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, so one of the really early songs that gets associated with this as being kind of paradigmatic is Motorhead's Overkill. And that's
Yeah.
got the guitar line is it's interesting actually when you think about that. It almost sounds sort of like a sped up version of Greek poetry. That dot 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 dot. That
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
it's those are feet, and those why does that work in poetry? For what are it's not so they don't use end rhyme like we do in English. It's meter that's going through. So I mean that song, right? The drums are also doing that as well and supporting it, and the bass is doing that dun da dun da dun dun da dun da dun dun da dun da. So there's a slower undertone to it. But yeah, the rhythmic component of it is pretty important, isn't it?
It's really important. And it's funny that you bring up the Motorhead, because um I listened to that one again, because it was one of the examples we had talked about, and I could see that being part of the root of it, because it's so heavy. But there's just something, we always say this, where I actually, every time we talk about Motorhead, there's such more like a rock and roll band to me. But it sounds like, and I asked myself, is this just a fast rock and roll song? You know, um, is this just like because it still feels like rock and roll, but it is have that straight eighth, like you said.
Yeah.
Um,
I think on that particular topic, and I don't want to get us too far in the weeds, but I'll say that you've been bringing that up, and I've been thinking about it more. And I want to say that despite saying that they're just rock and roll, they are heavy metal, in part because so many metal bands look to
yes.
them and tour with them, And another band that kind of fits in there like that, but I think has less claim to it is AC/DC.
Right.
I think Motorhead is more heavy metal, AC/DC is more hard rock.
I agree with that.
Now, Ken points out something interesting, more Motorhead stuff, Killed by Death and Orgasmatron. So Orgasmatron is slower, have similar rhythms. Motorhead at very least had a huge influence on speed metal. Yeah, and I think by the time that Orgasmatron is coming out in 84, that album has some fast songs on it, but they're slowing down a bit by comparison to some of their stuff just, on previous albums like Iron Fist, Ace of Spades, and then
Ace of
Another
Spades,
Perfect
that's what I
Day.
was thinking of. Yeah.
Yeah.
Ace of
And
Spades is
Killed by Death is an interesting one because that's a single. It's not on an album. Um, Yeah, maybe we'll return to that. So let's talk about drumming, right? So everybody brings up having the double bass drum thing, but what else? There's more going on, right, than just having a double bass. This is where
well,
rhythm is particularly important.
well, Hot for Teacher is double bass, just to return to that one.
Yeah.
Um but the band around it, everything I would say I can't think of an example where the eighth note is not agreed on being completely straight.
Okay.
Like even the rhythm you were singing before reminded me of the intro to Blackout by the Scorpions. I wonder what that would sound like sped up. Well,
Well, that's the funny thing is, like I was mentioning before, there are a lot of bands that aren't speed metal bands as such, but do have a tendency to play faster in concert. The Scorpions maybe less so than
yeah,
Judas Priest, but I mean, you listen to like the versions of the song on Unleashed from the East, and you're like, did these guys like have a schedule to maintain? Or somebody looking at the watch, like we got to get this song out of here quick because they're not like a time and a half or anything like that, but they're definitely like blazing through this stuff.
yeah. I was gonna say I noticed that seeing them in the last 5-7 years or whatever, they weren't playing. They were playing more the tempo of the record.
Right.
Um, and I wonder if that has to do with the young energy or being young and hungry and being out there and have the adrenaline going because the audience is so crazy, and then the maturity or getting older. It could be a number of things, but I agree, like live, and I never minded it. I never went, oh man, they're playing it too fast. It was,
Well, I think it's the opposite. I think for the right kind of crowd, then this feeds back into what was musically interesting about speed metal. It is energizing to have these things. You think about cover tunes. So when Metallica, now granted by this time they're thrash, but when they're covering new wave of British heavy metal songs, some of them are sped up, some of them aren't, but they're just heavier. Like their adaptation of Diamond Head's "Am I Evil" is crunchier and more distorted. What about, so I'll mention bass, that I think that when I'm listening to these things, there are some bands that are doing kind of straightforward, let's just follow the riff, maybe pedal notes or something like that, but mostly just kind of boring stuff. But there's other bands in this mix who are doing some really, really interesting bass lines where there's, all sorts of cool fills, and they're following through, and the bass is kind of tubular and crunchy at the same time, sort of like Steve Harris's bass and Iron Maiden, compositions. So I think that's an important element, that part of the rhythm section, and doing it fast. Prime example of that, I think, is you know uh, Acid and Jaguar and these sorts of bands. But I wanted to, since we got a guitar guy here, you should talk about what's really distinctive to speed metal guitar stuff from your point of view.
one of the technical things, interestingly enough, and you'll see well, the techno thing is keeping that fast note, like that's maybe doubling with the bass, keeping
Okay.
that fast going for so long. So it's like you really, like someone like me, I'm not a speed metal guitarist, and I would probably have trouble getting through a song just because of the technique that they use a certain technique, and
Okay.
it's endurance. And one of the jokes with Waddy Watchell, who's a session guitar player, he played with Stevie Nicks, and at the beginning of Edge of 17, he plays that for like 5 minutes before the song comes in. And the joke with him one time was, you know, is that difficult? He says, well, people have it a lot harder than me in some of the heavier bands, but it's true. It's kind of, you need a certain technique and an endurance to play those either power chords or those single note lines. Um, it's specific to that genre of music. If like the picking's fast, but hardly using any energy to do it, takes a lot of work. So
Hmm.
it's admittedly something I wouldn't be able. I could probably do it for a minute, maybe, depending on what it was. But I think making it through a whole show would be a specialized guitar player and bass player.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, you do see more use of picks, when you're
Yes,
looking at bass. And I
that's true.
suppose that gives you a little bit of an edge for a quicker attack, right? Than doing fingers.
Yeah, some of them will do the two finger thing.
Yep.
But I would argue for bass, a lot of times pick is part of the sound.
Right.
Like, I really think people will get more traditional electric players will get down. Oh, you're using a pick, that's cheating. That's not cheating. It's if you were to use your fingers, it would sound entirely different. It wouldn't have a sharper attack. What you need, that's very staccato, quick attack, because there needs to be definition between the notes, which are moving really fast.
Yeah.
Um,
I
so
remember
that's
when I first started playing, I learned to play, finger on the bass, and then somebody was like, "You should try a pick," and obviously a guitar pick is totally useless for that because it's too thin. So I started getting like pieces of thin plexiglass and just carving my own picks out of that, and that worked pretty good. But
that's
I
pretty
saw
well.
other people taking a quarter, and
Yes.
they'd do that too, and you'd get a pretty interesting sound out of that. So,
Yeah. Anything they had actually I don't know if you've ever seen those picks made of metal.
oh yeah,
And those, like bass players, that sounds really good, but I know heavy metal guitarists that use it because there's a certain scratch to it that's pretty cool.
okay.
Um
Well, coming back to the guitar, so I have an observation. I want to see whether you think this is right or not, because I think you pay a lot more attention to this. So soloing, right? Very important to heavy metal. My sense is that in what we can call speed metal, the soloing that happens, because there is soloing, it's not the guitarist like stepping out and being the virtuoso, the guitar hero or anything. It's mostly they're integral to the composition of the overall song. And some of them are very short, just like maybe one or two lines, and then they fade back into the main riff. But even in like extended bridges or stuff, it seems like they're not soloing just to like get out there and show how cool they are. It's part of the song, you know.
it's I mean, one of the characteristics is playing really, really fast. But I would say instead of note choice, we're paying attention to intensity.
Okay.
So it might take 100 notes to make one kind of feel or one kind of sound. When people say, "Oh, that," people often, and I don't know, I hear it a lot where if somebody plays fast, they have no feel, as if the amount of notes has to do with the sentiment, which is so not true. But speed metal, it has to, the solo has to have that intensity. You can't start to go David Gilmour on them with a scene, like over the top of it. You really, your time, your chops have to be in a certain way that the time and the attack of every note, even if there's 100 notes in a measure, It has to have that intensity, which is for the song, but I don't think of it as like, oh, they're just running scales. Well, that's how they're getting the effect. They know what they're doing. A
Yeah.
really, and I would agree it's for the song because, well, I mean, take a band like, I would say Racer X is speed metal.
Okay. Yeah. I think that's right.
And, people would get on Paul Gilbert's case. Oh, that's just gymnastics. No, I think that's part of the overall dynamic of the song. When the guitar comes in, you've got to make a sonic statement, and that's part of what it is. It's part of the excitement, in
Yeah.
my opinion. But
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And Andrew's asking a question about influence. So why don't we move to talking about the sort of development of it, how it's happening. Or actually, we'll come back to that later. There is one other thing I wanted to hit on that might help us define this as a movement or quasi genre. So, when we think about heavy metal itself coming out in the 70s, it's emerging from a broader genre. You could say rock, but it's not just rock, it's heavy rock. People are using that term a lot at the time. And so, prog is sometimes flowing into it, psychedelic stuff is flowing into it. And then bands are starting to produce that, and I think you can say a similar thing is happening with speed metal. There is no speed metal band where you're like, well, maybe this could be hard rock or AOR or something like that. It is all metal, and by the time that they're talking about speed metal, a lot of these bands, like every album will have a track that is either got heavy metal in the title or they're mentioning heavy metal. Acid's, first song, which is called Acid, is a great example. Acid is the name, heavy metal is the game, right? That's part of the lyric. So it's very self-consciously metal, and it's an intensification, I think you could say, of it. First, though, going to Andrew's question about, influences and Motorhead and punk, we can talk about bands producing particular songs that are speed metal, in the sense of embodying it or inspiring it later on. Only later on is there something being called that. And so, if we think about punk, there's a lot of people out there who claim that it has a big influence on speed metal. I know that there's some bands that you can say definitely are punk adjacent. Great example of that, I think, is Tank.
Yeah.
Because LG Ward is coming straight out of the Damned, right? So and they're like Motorhead in that it's fast, it's hard, there's a lot of stuff going on. So that makes sense. There were some bands, and I think it's more British than in other places. Definitely not the European bands, not the Canadian bands, where punk is in the background and having an influence. I think you could also say that it shares a couple traits in common with the punk movement, like the DIY approach, right? Not being into glam, being more about we want substance over look and aggression. But I think there's a much greater emphasis on you really need to know how to play your instruments.
Well, yeah. I think I do want to point out, because we've discussed this before, the question Andrew's asking about the punk influence. I mean, I think you and I have agreed early Iron Maiden with Paul Di'Anno had traits of punk, although it was,
yeah.
it
And
had
Paul
traits,
Di'Anno is a very punk singer. I'm willing to
right?
go that far.
And
Steve
his look,
Harris hated punk, though.
yeah, he hated punk, but I think maybe it's the sentiment of punk rather than um the other stuff. It's kind of like that,
Okay,
really
yeah.
raw, like really raw, like the beer soaked floor of the club kind of
The ethos.
feel. You got it. Yeah,
Yeah.
ethos. Thank you.
Yeah, and so that would line them up as well, I think, with some post-punk bands where you've got all that ethos stuff going forward. But again, they're like, well, we really do need to learn how to play our instruments well and put together good compositions. So, it's interesting. One way to figure that out is to look who's playing with who's at whose
Sure.
gigs and stuff like that. So you think about, a band like, say, New Model Army, where there's some pretty high level musicianship, but they're definitely post punk. They're not metal, but you could see people who like speed metal also liking New Model Army, I think.
Yeah, and another comparison just to bring it into another light is if you take traditional blues like Chicago blues, let's say like the BB
Yeah.
King,
Okay.
and that's not virtuosic music, but then you have people like George Lynch who started off learning the bends and the way that the sentiment of the blues phrasing, and then brought it to something that didn't sound like blues at all, but it did have that kind of
Oh,
selling
interesting.
of the phrase of the notes and how he did it. And so I think some of this we're seeing with the post punk that, you didn't have to be big into punk. Maybe you were, like you said, maybe you were at some of the gigs and remember the feeling it had rather than the musicianship it had. That might be
Yeah.
something.
Yeah. That makes sense, I think. Yeah. So let's talk about when the term actually starts getting used. And this would be, the early 80s. I would say that, and I'd be curious to hear what you, Scott, and other people would say about this. I would say that I first started hearing the term here in Wisconsin, maybe start to get used a lot around 85.
Yeah.
And we were probably like lagging behind other places. And it was usually like in the context of some older, not older, but slightly older, like a couple of years older, which felt like a million years at that time, handing you a cassette and being like, you got to listen to these guys, man. And you'd be like, well, what is this? And they're like, it's Raven, it's speed metal, or
Speed
it's
metal.
Venom, or it's, whoever else. This is Accept, man. You got to listen to this. But it was always said in this kind of tone of voice, like you were getting access to something that was the real stuff.
That's right.
Okay, so you had a similar experience.
Well, for me, it was when the emergence of like Metallica,
Okay.
when they kind of came out and people, I mean, Master of
Yeah.
Puppets
When
was,
I first heard Metallica, and it was Ride the Lightning album. It was in
yeah,
the basement of some guy's place who had like a great stereo with the equalizers, and so turn on the lights out or turn them down, you can see the little lines and stuff. And he put it on. It was a record, and he described it as speed metal. It was before people were really using the word thrash.
right. Yeah, I remember hearing speed metal first. In fact, I think it was I think I feel like it was Master of Puppets, or at least that's the first speed metal type song I learned
Okay.
from the band. And then it was kind of cool, right, in your parents' basement to try to work out some of this music. And it was like coming from Ozzy that was heavy in the early 80s, right? And then hearing Metallica was a huge difference.
Yeah.
These guys are crazy, but there's something
Yeah.
that I liked.
So Rob says, for me, Metallica and Megadeth were the first bands I heard call speed metal, Kill 'Em All
Kill 'em all.
especially. And I think Rob is basically our age as well, and then Ken too. Now Ken is giving us a British perspective. The first time I was introduced to Venom, they were described as like Maiden but speedier. By 85, we had bands such as Metallica, early Slayer, and Metal Church, the latter being an example of a band who were described as speed metal from their inception. Yeah. And
Yeah,
I think those first two albums can be described as thrash retrospectively, but I
right.
think they really are speed metal, Metal Church and the Dark.
Yeah, thrash at the time, to me, and this is just an impression at the time, when both terms started to get used, thrash to me was like a less clean speed metal.
Yeah. I
That's
think
the
as
impression.
these bands were starting to transition, and this is something we're gonna explore a
Yeah.
little bit more in detail. So let's talk about some of the other things that we can observe, right? So we've got these cool associations with it. It's used in a vague sense to mean heavy metal music that's played fast, both in the studio and in concert. Sometimes it's used sort of in a evocative way to say this band is like this band. I think that it got used in what we can call a non-exclusive sense by a number of people, musicians, fans, critics, so that in saying that something was speed, it wasn't like saying it's this and not that, right? So you see these people out there saying sometimes like, well, Kronos, for example, Kronos from Venom. We, you know, I found a interesting quote. He said, "When I first started playing, I used to say I was a long-haired punk playing power metal, so that's a use of that term. Very different than what we call power metal, you know, by the '90s or so. By the early 1980s, I coined the terms black metal plus thrash, death, and speed metal to describe the styles I played. People couldn't put my styles in a category, so I had to invent new ones. I don't think he invented thrash. I think that was
Right.
I think he's misremembering that. But I've seen interviews with him early on where they're like, "What kind of metal do you play?" You know, these reporters who are sort of like the straight guy in a comedic act, and he's like, "Man, I play power metal, I play speed metal," and he's just like throwing a whole bunch of different epithets together. And I think he's not trying to say I belong to this category. I think it's more like these are words that are supposed to be evocative of like something new happening. So that's, you know, you could call it an evocative or synonymous sense. And I think that, you know, as we're talking about transitioning to thrash, it was a way in which a lot of these early big important thrash bands described their music before they transitioned. So Dave Mustaine is on record as having called early Metallica and then even early Megadeth speed metal before he called it thrash metal. So,
Right.
you know, um, do we call them speed metal now? No, we typically call them thrash metal because we're looking at it retrospectively, you know. Um,
As it unfolds versus looking in the rear view mirror at it.
yeah,
This, we're talking about stuff that started to, find its way to our parents' basement, right, with your friends, and there was no internet to like tell us exactly what we're supposed to be calling it, but we did kind of have a common theme. I mean, you and I grew up far away from each other, but we seem to have the same terms.
you know, it's interesting too. Um, you could say that speed metal, you know, at least here in the United States, unless you were like in a huge market like New York City or LA, just did not succeed in getting itself on the radio. You know,
Right.
it was definitely more of a like trading tapes, recommendations kind of thing. I'd be curious, you know, what Ken's experience with this was, because it seems like the British, you know, not just the pub scene and places where you could go to listen to stuff, but the radio scene was more diverse metal wise than our radio stations tended to be.
Well, with us, we would have that 1 hour a week of
If
the
you're
metal.
lucky, yeah.
Yeah, and that's the only time I heard bands like Iron Maiden and Judas Priest on the radio.
Yeah.
And that was about 84, 85, around the time of Peace of Mind.
Yeah, and it's kind of weird. It was a bit selective. Like you'd hear the Scorpions, and the Scorpions are, you know, in that time just as heavy as those bands. Um, and you
Oh,
know, I remember later on you wouldn't hear except Restless and Wild or anything before that on the radio, but in our local like, you know, hard rock station, you would hear stuff from Balls to the Wall, you
right.
know. So something
With
changed.
the Scorpions had Still Loving You. They had the power ballad
That's true, yeah.
that brought them
Yeah.
on too. But no, I mean Big City Nights and all that stuff. I mean, we heard that stuff on the radio. Blackout, didn't we?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
And then Dio was able to get on the radio, but maybe that's because he'd been in Rainbow and Black Sabbath, you know?
yeah.
Um,
Well, he was on the definitely lasted
now,
long.
now Ken says rock and metal radio here was somewhat diverse, but only in specialist rock shows that were usually on very late at night. So similar to what you were experiencing. And then Ken also said after Venom broke up for the first time, Kronos used to do fitness classes for people during which he'd play speed metal for the people taking part. That sounds very funny. I can't imagine doing a fitness class with Kronos. You know, that must have really been
I think
something.
I'd do it just to do it. That would be something to talk about if I survive
Yeah,
it.
yeah. Andrew says that's really interesting. I'm significantly younger. Just and these bands when introduced to me were called thrash, so that tracks. You know,
Yeah,
I think a difference in just 5 or 10 years probably determines that, right? Um, so now he asks, I wonder when speed metal got discarded as a cool kid term, and I think that in that case, I think you can say that it really was a matter of thrash displacing it. You know,
yeah. I mean,
if you
thrash is
wanted to show that you were like into extreme stuff, you would talk about I listened to thrash metal, and it named a kind of a coherent thing, or you would say I listened to like death metal, right? That was another possibility.
yep. Of course, on the it's historically important to point out that on the airwaves, like the Phil Donahue show and all that stuff, it was all satanic
Yeah,
music, you
that's
know,
right.
which was interesting from like some people's perspective. It was all lumped uh into one thing, and that was Satan. And and all the lawsuits that were happening with there's backward satanic messages. And it's funny to look back on that, but wow, at the
Yeah,
time it
I
was.
mean, I think this is somewhat of a different topic, but the let's call them not critics as in musical critics, but critics as like cultural critics that are saying heavy metal is awful and we need to somehow get rid of it. I don't think that they were very attuned to like the differences between types of metal that we metalheads were like, you wouldn't catch us lumping, say, Poison in with Slayer, right? But they would indiscriminately throw all these bands together, no matter what they were, so long as they had a kind of distinctive, so long as they were classified as heavy metal, you know?
Right, which shows that us from the fan standpoint were much more discriminating against, like, we would we actually had much more of a what's the word, a criteria.
Mm.
It's just like what you said, the critics, as you call them, it was just all, if they looked like a rock band, whether it was Poison or Slayer, they were the same thing. But then you and I would have had a laugh about it at the time, because we're
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
it's like, oh, they think that Poison, it's like, almost like we're the arrogant ones, as far as, like, we're the experts. We were the experts on it.
Yeah, there you go. Ken says in the UK, the term thrash completely displaced mention of speed metal by about 86, 87. It had mostly taken over with a relatively small number of bands diverging in the direction of what we now describe as power metal. And yeah, I think that was, when we asked the question, which we're going to talk about a little bit more, well, what did speed metal turn into? So thrash is one current, power metal is another. Um, Death metal and black metal would be, so we're talking about, three extreme varieties of metal and then one that's more melodic and becomes its own big movement, I guess you could say, right? Rob says my recollection matches with Ken, so I think that tracks very well. There is also some overlap, you can say, with the new wave of British heavy metal. you know we're going to talk about those, and one of the like little digressions that we could go into, there's definitely songs that are influential. We've talked about, we're going to talk about Judas Priest a bit more in a bit, and Motorhead precursors. But I'll throw this out there. I'm kind of wondering about this. Iron Maiden's first two albums with Paul Di'Anno singing more, let's call them sparse compositions by comparison to Number of the Beast, Peace of Mind, Power Slave. There's more space, I think, in the playing. It's still very wall of sound, but it's not like what you're getting in Number of the Beast onward. It's fast stuff, a lot
Right.
of it. Nobody really calls them speed metal. Should we consider early Iron Maiden to be speed metal or not?
I never know. I mean, certainly if you this might be an example of if you sped up some of their songs, but I don't think we ever referred to them. I think we just referred to them as
Heavy
heavy
metal.
metal.
Yeah. So like the mainstream that they now call traditional heavy metal, you know?
And that's, just one clip I saw of Ozzy back in about 85. They were asking him questions about Michael Jackson and Boy George. And they asked him and he loved Boy George, by the way. He's like, wonderful, wonderful. He found Michael Jackson boring. And then they said, what's the greatest heavy metal? And he said, heavy metal. He said, probably Iron Maiden.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So, it was kind of like, there we go. There was like, one of the godfathers,
Yeah.
using the term heavy metal.
Well, he wasn't going to say Dio. Actually, that brings up another one. So Dio's first two albums, you wouldn't say that like Holy Diver is, or Invisible or stuff like that, or speed metal, but and I don't even think We Rock could be said to. It's not
No.
fast enough. But I Speed at Night, that's a fast song.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a fast song, but
Or is it still just too much traditional heavy metal?
it's an up tempo heavy metal song, I think, as opposed to a speed metal song. I guess is for lack of a better.
Okay.
Like I don't know if I could. It's kind of like yeah, it's fast, but the players aren't really speed metal players in the band. They can play an up tempo metal tune, but
Ooh, that's a good distinction. Yeah,
yeah,
I think that's really helpful. I love Jimmy Bain's bass.
yes, me
But yeah,
too.
he's not doing the sort of things that say John Gallagher is doing in Raven, or Kronos is doing in Venom. Yeah, I think that's a good, yeah.
Yeah, if you were to stick them in a speed metal band, they wouldn't work because
Okay.
they don't play that. Let's say they don't play that style of music.
The other thing too that maybe would perhaps militate against Dio, you don't see speed metal bands that have keyboards in them. Actually, one of the bands that we're going to talk about, once they started putting keyboards in, they're done with their speed metal phase, and they had some really great stuff at first, but then they went kind of AOR. It's all, one or two guitars, a bass, drums, and a vocalist. And it could be just a power trio, the way Raven and Venom are, or early Tank, right? Before they had two guitarists. Or it could be as big as a 5-piece with singer, two guitars, bass, and drums. But you're not going to see, a Claude Schnell coming in with his keyboards the way you do with Dio, where it actually works.
And interesting you say that because Yngwie Malmsteen had a lot of really fast songs, but he had Jans Johansson playing keyboard, so it was more like Bach rock.
Yeah, and I think that feeds into the later power metal stuff too, which was more,
Right.
orchestral that way, right?
And back to your point, I apologize, I didn't react. You asked about the early Iron Maiden. Yes, and I think that as far as the density of it, we didn't hear that much twin guitars till Bruce Dickinson got in the band. Like the Trooper, for example, that's like that twin guitar thing is so signature, and they're playing harmony parts like crazy. But they didn't do that as much on the first two albums.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, all the albums that became their trademark is playing like Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, or where they had those long passages of like guitars playing harmonies together.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's take up a few of the other things. So Ken brings up Speed King by Deep Purple. And we can, when we're looking at the history of speed metal, there's a precursor era or not area, where some of the bands are, without like intending to, they're charting away. They're projecting something. So I think Deep Purple's Speed King. People also bring up Highway Star, and these are interesting because you do have an organ in there, right? Because Deep Purple is one of those 5-piece organ rather than second guitar bands, and it works. And I think you can say that these are definitely influencing things. Some people want to say that Black Sabbath maybe has a role in it, and they say Paranoid and Children of the Grave, or they talk about some fast break parts of songs. I'm not convinced that Deep Purple is really that big of an influence on speed metal, though.
No,
Myself,
I mean, maybe in some indirect way that they influence metal, but
yeah,
I don't see I don't see elements that people said, oh yeah, it was black, it was Deep Purple for us, man. It
yeah.
was Deep Purple that really gave us that push. I've never heard anybody that played that stuff describe it as that. It evolved later on, I think, as we said. Yeah.
Yeah, and so this is a good place to talk about like two absolutely critical bands that aren't speed metal bands, but I mean, when you have speed metal bands being named after their songs, I think that's pretty clear. So, Judas Priest, right? And I put together some songs that I think are arguably speed metal songs. And I would say it goes as far back as Sin After Sin and Dissident Aggressor. Um, you agree with that one?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, intensity wise too, and the vocals, I'll say that the vocals that Halford really helps with that kind of almost um
Yeah,
like he's a machine. We would always just describe him as a machine,
yeah.
right?
I was just laughing because the vocals they're wonderful, right? And it's Halford doing what he does really well.
Yeah.
When you actually read them, you're like, "What the hell is this crap about? What's going on here?" And it's such a cool song, right? But I think a lot of speed metal songs are like that. They're like, we're gonna, amp everything up, and it's gonna be very aggressive, and we're gonna talk about war, we're gonna talk about this and that, and it doesn't all have to like fit.
Right. Yeah. 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 But I mean, yeah, I agree with that.
So
Priest.
Ken
Oh,
says Slayer did an excellent cover of Dissident Aggressor. So more
oh,
more
really? I didn't know that.
confirmation for it. Exciter, of course, from Stained Class, the band that names itself Exciter. I kind of think that Running Wild could be considered. It's got a fast tempo, It's got that dun,
Yeah.
So maybe that works. Hellbent for Leather, I would argue, works
Yeah.
for that rapid fire, but they're not a speed metal band. And then we got Motorhead, and people always bring up Overkill and Ace of Spades. I kind of think so. Here's my suggestions, and maybe people think I'm totally wrong about these. White Line Fever from 79 seems to me to be one. Dead Men Tell No Tales. I think that could be viewed as a precursor song. It's pretty fast. Stone Dead Forever, also from 79. And I want to say We Are the Road Crew could be a speed metal song.
I would say definitely, yeah, in the sense that I could see that directly influencing what happened after.
Okay. But maybe not in the sense of it being a legitimate, like, standalone speed metal song, you're saying, right?
I maybe it's an ethos thing.
I'm willing to be corrected on
I mean,
these stands in the
I
dark.
I don't know if it's just my thing. It's like, they're fast rock and roll tunes or fast metal tunes. I think they're up tempo, but we don't want to confuse that for speed metal.
Yeah. But they also, I mean, Motorhead has a really distinct advantage. So a lot of
Yes,
speed metal stuff is dirty sounding. It's not just fast, but you've got like a tight connection between um, bass, drums, and guitars. Motorhead has that,
very
right?
tough. Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. Maybe
Yeah.
maybe that works. But definitely they're all adding to the mix. And then,
Yes.
we're going to get the new wave of heavy metal playing a big role in there. But I think a couple factors that, when I'm looking at the different bands and their histories, so quite a few of these bands wind up touring with each other. Like, the later speed metal bands are like opening for Motorhead or opening for Judas Priest or other, speed metal bands. And I think that you could say that they're finding out about possible producers. Some of these guys are later on turning to that. There's three record companies that I would say, when you look at where people are putting their speed metal albums out, wind up being the most important. One of them is a British one, Neat, right? That's associated with Raven and with Venom and a number of others. And then Metal Blade and Shrapnel Records, right?
Shrapnel.
Those are the ones that are like willing to take a chance and pump some money in, and they're putting out um, uh, compilations. And I think compilation albums probably played an important role too.
Oh God, that's how we got introduced to things back then.
Yeah,
The compilation album, and and that's such a great point about the labels
it's
because
interesting too, because you would have compilation albums that were put out by people who are like, this heavy metal thing is big. We need to like glom some stuff in. So like Masters of Metal, which almost everybody had, like in my neighborhood, when you think about it, like some of the bands in there were not metal. It was just, popular stuff. But Metal Killers collection, or the famous Metal for Mothers, those are like compilations by people who know the music, who they're like the older guy who's like, man, you got to listen to this tape. There's really good stuff.
yeah, it wasn't the K-Tel stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. So some interesting points here. Mark says, today I get introduced to things by YouTube or Spotify playlists, the compilation albums of today. Yeah. I mean, I think we have a different musical ecosystem. I actually learned a lot about metal bands that I'd never heard of when Pandora was a big thing, because they used the Musical Genome Project, and I'd hear about bands that I didn't know about. So that'd be like 2008 to like 2013 or so. But another thing I think that was really quite important, and I've already mentioned this, is the role of informal networks of tape trading,
Right.
dubbing stuff, cluing each other in, especially if you lived in areas where you couldn't see these bands easily, right? Raven was not coming to the um, Milwaukee Mecca Arena. Um, but you could, I remember I learned about him through a dirtbag friend of mine, who, handed me a couple tapes. He's like, I made these for you, listen to it. And it was 45-minute tapes, because you could get an entire album on each side, and it was two Raven stuff, and I was like, oh, this is amazing, give me more of this. So,
Yep.
oh, Mark specifies not random playlists, so not just algorithm, but curated playlists.
Yes. Yeah. Although the playlists are difficult now because the intent is to introduce you, but let's say that you and I had a heavy metal band, Greg, and let's say that we put out an album by ourselves and we put it on Spotify. It's not going to be suggested to people unless we pay and we have enough
Oh, okay.
money, so it's not as organic as we like to think. So it's why that some people go on there going, why is Jay-Z always the first thing I see on I only listen to heavy metal. It's the amount of money kind of goes in. You will say, because you liked this, we thought you might like that.
Yeah.
But that has to be part of the pay. It's the modern day payola. like, you know, how they used to do it for
That's
radio.
right. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, but
And
not to not.
it's harder maybe to rely on these informal networks, right? You could be an Iron Maiden and get very little radio airplay and still tour and sell a lot of records and develop a huge fan base, right? Maybe harder now to do something like that.
I mean, yeah, because it doesn't work the way it used to work when we did it. You know,
Yeah.
I see Berkeley students not trading ideas anymore. There's not as much diversity in what they listen to. And you think
Okay.
they have access to more stuff, but you know, they'll be like the hot two guitarists of every 5 years, and that's all everyone listens to. So there's no, hey, I'm hip to something, you want to check this out. So there's with Iron Maiden, that was more of a, there became a subculture for them, and they were always really proud of that. That, you know,
Yeah.
we weren't on the radio, but look, you know, we sell out arenas.
Yeah. Ken points out social media along with Bandcamp is a good way for smaller bands to advertise themselves. And Bandcamp seems to be relatively honest with their preferential suggestions. What do you think, Scott? I don't know myself.
I mean, the problem is, you know, there's thousands and thousands of thousands of new singles that go up every day on these things, and the problem I have, if you don't have the money, the only way somebody can go listen to you is if they know who you are. They look you up. So they say, let's say Greg Sadler has something new out, but you don't have the money to get in the playlist and everything. Even on Bandcamp, you'd have to say Greg Sadler Bandcamp. Then I could find you. But
Yeah,
I
yeah.
wouldn't find you organically if unless somebody sent me a link saying you should check this guy out, which I feel like that happens less now than it did with the trading tapes and the Big Brother going, "You're not cool. You haven't heard this Priest album yet." You know?
Well, and there was an anticipation too. Like we'd read in the magazines, Iron Maiden's got a new album coming out 2 months from now. Oh man, we got to get it when it comes out, or Ozzy's got a new album or something like that.
Yeah, remember when you go to the record store, they would have the new release of the upcoming
Yeah.
releases up.
Yeah.
That was cool. I mean, and then there was always excitement for it. It's like, oh man, tomorrow's the day, and I used to go with my friends on release day.
That's true. Yeah, that and getting concert tickets, right? They're going to start selling this day, and then people line up around the block because there wasn't any buying it online. You had to actually like physically show up, and that made it tough for those of us who lived out in the sticks, of course. But all right, so back. Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I was gonna say, but yeah, but for $15 you could go see anyone, or $10 to $15, you know, and anybody with a part-time job could go to concerts.
Yeah.
So, but yeah,
definitely a different economic ecosystem,
That's exactly right.
So we were going to talk about, so there's actually a question in here or a point. Yeah. So Ken said, could we say speed metal developed somewhat independently in different parts of the world? And
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, independently might be too strong of a term, but there were definitely, like, say, regions, right? Canada has got its own really interesting ecosystem. The new wave of British heavy metal coinciding with it, and then like leading forward with it is a different scene. I would say there's a European scene that's mostly German, but also Belgian and Swiss as well. And then, of course, we got the US, right? And then Japan, we've got Japan X, and they're definitely within that spectrum. Some people want to say Loudness is, but I don't quite buy it. I think they're more traditional heavy metal.
Where they get that from is it's shred guitar in it.
Okay. Yeah.
It's so the guitarist is, why am I forgetting his name? But he was like extremely technical class player. But
I mean, you've got that in regular heavy metal. Think about, you brought up George Lynch before. He's a shredder, and Dokken, which is heavy metal, sort of like moving into the glam territory, I'd say.
Yeah, this was more although George Lynch could play really fast, he wasn't classified as a shred guitarist.
Okay.
This is like you know, God, this is hard to define. Like the sweep arpeggios or the picking the scales up and down really fast. I think that like the shrapnel guys,
Okay.
like or anybody on shrapnel, that was a lot of it was speed metal, but some of it was metal with very fast guitar playing in the solos.
Yeah.
So that's a distinction that I wouldn't get confused. I wouldn't call just because you have a very technically great fast guitar player, it makes you speed metal. So I agree with what I don't agree that
Well,
loudness would be metal.
I think part of that is that they're not playing as a band, they're not playing as fast.
Right.
But then you the soloing can be quite fast. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I would agree with you on the loudness thing. Great
Okay.
band, but
Yeah, I love them, but you
yeah.
know, um, so new wave of British heavy metal. That's pretty central. There's definitely speed metal bands. And I think you could even say like there's speed metal bands that wind up being influential on other speed metal bands. So we've got Raven, obviously speed metal. They called themselves athletic metal, in part because they put on the pads and stuff like that. But their songs are fast as hell, right? So and it's three guys putting out a lot of music. Mark Gallagher's guitar playing is he's either riffing or he's soloing, and um uh or John Gallagher rather. Mark Gallagher is the singer and bassist. So pretty standard stuff. There's Venom, of course. um the first two albums are considered speed metal, along as Kronos also says. It's also black metal, and it's power metal, and it's everything that you think of. Even the second side of that weird concept album, At War with Satan, from 1984, the second side is like straight out speed metal. And I would say Possessed is too, from 85. So they're a solid contributor. Tank. Now, Tank is an interesting one because the Filth Hounds of Hades, and Power of the Hunter, their first two albums, definitely speed metal. When you listen to This Means War, they're kind of slowing down, and there's keyboards in there, and so I don't think that's speed metal anymore. I
No.
love Honor and Blood. That's my favorite album of them. They've got two guitarists on there, some keyboard stuff at certain places. Some of the songs are over 7 minutes long. They're heavy, they're driving. I love LG Ward too, but it's definitely no longer speed metal.
Now, speaking of the old school, you're the one that turned me on to that album. And remember, I really liked it a lot when the first time I heard it. I remember texting you going, but that's so funny because when we were discussing Tank, I didn't think of them as speed metal because that's the album that I really dug into.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's definitely slow down is an accurate term.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's it.
Yeah.
It is very heavy, plotting even at certain points. There's no longer that like forward movement to it, you could say.
Yeah, that like feeling on the edge of something.
Oh yeah, that's a good way to describe it. Yeah.
Because there's no like cushiony leaning back. You're really kind of on the edge of something, and
Yeah.
you hope the music doesn't fall apart because you fall over. But yeah, it is. It is that kind of feeling of the urgency, or what did I use before?
Yeah.
Enterprise.
There are three other bands that I think are particularly worth looking at, and one of them. So I mentioned there's a band that really great power or speed metal band originally, and then I don't know what the hell was going through their mind, but it became just garbage. So Jaguar. And Jaguar's still out. They reformed. They produce later stuff down the line. They sort of learned their lesson. So Power Games, the whole friggin' album is speed metal. It's really technical and it's great. Even even the slow bridges where they seem to be like slowing down, they got you fooled. It's going to be fast again, So Power Games is great. And they, like the signature song on there is called Axe Crazy. And it's these very fast lyrics, and then the verse is axe crazy, and what's the axe? The guitar. So it's thematic metal stuff. They followed up with a album called This Time, and it's just if you're into that sort of stuff, it's not terrible. But if you're expecting speed metal or even heavy metal, it's just awful. I don't know what they were thinking. And they broke up soon after that. There's another band called Battle Axe, and they're pretty good. Burn This Town in 83, Power from the Universe 1984. It's speed metal stuff, and it's the kind of dirty, charging ahead stuff that you'd associate with speed metal. And then there's another band that doesn't last long called Autumn Croft. They have an album called Future Warriors. That's speed metal. One reason they're not going to last that long is that their guitarist, or no, is it their bassist? It's their guitarist will join Venom after a while.
Oh, so, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so typical old story of you lose a member to another more successful band,
right?
So I think the new wave of British heavy metal, there's a good bit of speed metal in there. Obviously, it's not the majority of the new wave of British heavy metal, but
notice the year time frame goes with what we remember: 83, 84, 85.
Yeah.
Earlier on, we were discussing kind of when we became aware, and we all kind of agreed it was around that time frame. And it just happened to be looking down this list, the specific one right here, that's right in the time frame we're talking about.
That's right. And some of these are bands that we couldn't, unless we had access to imports, we wouldn't have heard of over here.
Actually, import, yeah, always.
Yeah. So then, then there's a European metal scene that's pretty important, except Restless and Wild is usually regarded as a really, really paradigmatic album. Balls to the Wall clearly isn't, but I don't know, the song Fight It Back could still be considered speed metal, possibly. I think that Breaker from 81 also has some speed metal songs, but you go further back and they're not speed metal. They're good, interesting metal, but not speed metal. I think that Warlock could be argued to be doing some speed metal. So, that's 84, 85. I don't think that they're a speed metal band, but I think that at least before Doro comes over to the United States and starts shedding Germans and replacing them with Americans.
Yeah, right.
They're doing it. And then we get these 4, bands that are all doing speed metal of a sort. And then they're going to switch to something else before too long. So Halloween, right? Their Walls of Jericho is viewed as speed metal. I think that's right. And then they get a singer, like a proper singer, instead of Kai Hansen singing. I actually found an interview where he's like, yeah, we wanted to do more intricate stuff on the guitar and more technical stuff. So we thought it'd be cool to have a real front man, a real singer. Now, listen to this line. We heard Queensryche, the first album that they did, and we thought, wow, would that be cool to have a singer like that who could be very stable on the high soaring notes and have a lot of expression. No surprise they moved to power metal, right?
Yeah.
So
well, what year was the live album I Want Out? Was that 85, 86? I don't even know.
For Halloween?
Halloween, I Want Out. Yeah, the live record.
Oh, I don't know. That's a good question.
Because that's the first one that I had. But yeah, I mean, it had that the vocals were very high and stable, just like the quote. So
yeah,
it must have been mid to late 80s, I think.
Yeah, and then we get Rage, who do a number of albums pretty consistently, one a year from 85 to 89, and they're starting out as speed metal and they become power metal. So they kind of find their niche. Gravedigger, I would say that album Heavy Metal Breakdown is a great speed metal album. They have a couple more albums after that. And then we get a really funny transition, Running Wild. Speed metal band originally. And what do they transition to? Pirate metal. weird, wacky genre that
I
I don't
love
know,
it.
maybe what's that?
I love it. Pirate metal is just such a cool genre name.
Yeah, and it's all nautical themed, and maybe about someday we'll have to do an episode specifically about the weird, wacky subgenres that you got to really be into to get into. But
Right.
I think so there's also this Hellhammer band, which is the precursor to Celtic Frost. They got considered black metal, but listening to them, I could see how they could be considered speed metal at the time. I don't think there's like a distinction happening at the time. They suffered from some really bad press, but maybe unfairly, because you listen to them and you're like, this sounds kind of like Venom. Uh, it sounds like it's recorded in a basement, and there's some dissonances because it seems like the guitars aren't fully tuned, but I mean, they're playing fast, heavy stuff. So that's pretty good. And then, there's two Belgian bands. And I think Belgium is always overlooked. So there's
Yeah.
Ostrogoth, and they're pretty good. They've got, 3 albums in the 80s, but the real standout is Acid. And they're a bizarre band. You read in interviews with the members and they're like, we had no idea what the hell we were doing. We just found some musicians. They're fronted by a female singer who I would say can give Doro a run for her money in terms of her pipes. And she's got that gravelly voice. Whoever was writing the songs did a great job. So 82, 83, and 85, very fast, heavy, consistently good stuff. And they hardly ever get talked about.
Yeah. I wasn't aware of them. That's before. So interesting.
Yeah. So there we've got two very different regional scenes, right? And then we can talk about Canada. And I think, in some respect, bands are at a slight advantage in Canada because if you do manage to produce albums, Canadian radio has to play a certain proportion of Canadian stuff. So you're probably going to have an easier time getting on the radio. But um, some of the bands that were really quite good got screwed around by management or their record companies. Anvil is probably the most famous. There's a documentary out there about them where you can see some of the stuff they went through. And, so they're doing speed metal, arguably, certainly in their first 3 albums. Not all the way. I mean, Metal on Metal, the song is a little bit slower, but it's pretty fast stuff.
Yeah.
And then we get Exciter, right? Named after a Judas Priest song. They've got this, they start out with Heavy Metal Maniac in 83, and they just keep pushing stuff out, and they never transition into thrash. Voivod, their first album is War and Pain, is a speed metal album. Now they don't stay with a particular genre. They're I don't know. Who should we liken them to? They like to experiment and move around in different stuff. They're kind of proggy in later stuff.
Yeah. I mean, the stuff that I heard were, I don't know. I don't know what I would say heavy, but the thrash, I would say, no, you wouldn't.
Well, they definitely move into thrash territory too. That's right.
Yeah, right. That would be an interesting one, a thrash prog band, which exists now. I'm sure there's so many genres now, but I'm thinking the timeline of what we're going for, and it's like, yeah, I mean, go back to Maiden. We could say there's elements of the sentiment of punk, but it was proggy because it was harder music to play.
Yeah.
I don't, so
No, I think that's right. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, total side note, a while back we saw 2 all-female tribute bands, Paradise Kitty and the Iron Maidens. and it was, both were really fun to watch. It's cool to see classic songs done in a certain way, but at the end of the night, I was like, the Paradise Kitty, they did good, good following the songs, nice adaptations. But to be able to sing like Bruce Dickinson and play bass like Steve Harris, that's like a whole other level,
Yeah.
So
I've had 3 students in the past that have been in the Iron Maidens, and one that's in it now. That you may have saw Shawnee, long, kind of wavy black hair. I don't know if, but yeah, that's like they're based out of LA, but
yeah.
it's I've seen them only once with one of the lineups, and I thought they were good. It's but like you say, that's kind of like, come on. Like, there's only one Steve Harris. There's only,
Well, whoever was playing bass that night, she didn't miss anything.
it's the same one. She's a constant. I forget her name,
Okay.
but I thought, yeah, she was. But I'm saying, like, going into it, right? I don't know if you had your thoughts going. Is this a gimmick? But I was impressed. I mean, especially what they chose for a set list was interesting.
It's interesting too. If I remember my music history right, so there was an all-female band called Blue Steel, I want to say,
Yes.
in the late 80s, early 90s, and the original Iron Maidens, it wasn't just the band like changed their name and became that, but I want to say like 2 or 3 of the members of Blue Steel were in the original Iron Maidens because they've been around for like decades.
Oh, it's Phantom Blue you're thinking of, and
Phantom Blue. There you go. Yeah, yeah.
And the drummer is still in the band. You saw the drummer of Phantom Blue.
Yeah,
she's great.
Yeah,
and that was a good band. That was a shrapnel band.
I know. They just wrong time. They got into
yep.
it a little bit too late, and it didn't work. But yeah, there are some all female bands that frankly were kind of weak stuff.
Right.
But there were plenty of all male metal bands when heavy metal was big that were pretty weak stuff as well. But there were some that were really, really quite good,
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
Well, let's talk about just a few other Canadian ones. So there's an EP that was put out by a band called Witch Killer, and it's called Day of the Saxons, and that's the lead song on it. It's pretty cheesy, but it's good speed metal. And then there's a band called Pile Driver. That's not a real band. It was a studio project where a husband and wife got together, and then they hired a couple other musicians, and they wanted to make the heaviest, hardest album they possibly could. So they put out this record called Metal Inquisition, and it's good. It's legitimate speed metal. They never toured, they didn't exist as an actual band. They sold a lot of albums, so that's kind of funny.
Speed metal.
Yeah, and then we get Razor, and Razor's still around. Executioner's Song. So now we're talking 85, 80, 86 through 88 for their first 5 albums. And they're clearly speed metal. And I actually like them quite a bit. I think I found them only a couple of years ago through recommendations of you like this band, you'll like that band. So that's kind of the big name Canadian scene. Obviously, there were plenty of speed metal bands that just never emerged, never managed to produce an album. But let's come back to Ken. Coming back to the Iron Maidens, both Bruce and Steve have been to see the Iron Maidens and have praised their abilities. So that's pretty
true.
Good.
Yeah.
And then we get some discussion about Overkill. This is Andrew. What do you think about Overkill's Feel the Fire? It was given to me as an originator of thrash band that I must know. Raise the Dead seems to be a bridging song from speed metal to thrash, stripped down, kind of abrasive. I like this term, even go for as to say feral energy. And Ken says, I would agree, early Overkill was speed metal in essence, though they later became what we know as thrash. So great segue into talking about the American scene, because on the one hand, we have some bands that are considered by some people to be speed metal, but I don't really think like Riot. I love Riot. I think they're an underrated band. I would say a few tracks on Narita and the album that came right after that could be considered speed metal. I don't think anything on Rock City 1977 is speed metal. Man of War, some people say that they're speed metal. Black Fire and Steel, maybe that's a fast song. um I don't know. I think they're more traditional heavy metal that shifts into power metal.
Power metal. Yeah.
Okay.
I would agree with that term. That's the one.
What do you think? So, speaking of bands that are speed metal and then become thrash. So, a lot of people say Anthrax Fistful of Metal in 1984 is definitely speed metal. I'm willing to go along with that.
And
And what's that?
I was going to say, in fact, Anthrax was like at the time, the poster child for speed metal, like when they started to come out. Remember?
Yeah. So here's my question. What about Spreading the Disease? I mean,
What?
Anthrax is supposed to be a thrash band, but I don't know. Spreading the Disease, you don't have like a lot of the elements that we typically associate with thrash, like the palm muting or stuff like
Right.
that. I mean, and it's fast. It's really abrasive. I love that album. That's probably one of my favorite albums by them.
Mm.
Speed metal or not?
No, but done by a speed metal band. I don't
Oh,
know.
okay.
Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Then we get some others that are more clearly speed metal. So we got this Hellstar band coming out of Texas, first album in '84. They're going to move later into power metal. And so it's interesting because a lot of the speed metal bands in America are going to transition into thrash, but some of them do transition into power metal. But I think you can say that American power metal is something a bit different than German power metal, you know?
Yeah. Well, German is more German in the sense
Well, and
of,
more melodic, perhaps,
yeah,
too.
yeah. Uh, yeah.
And then we get Savage Grace, Agent Steel, and Agent Steel is kind of funny because it's formed by a guy after he gets fired from Megadeth, so he's bringing, some, let's call it early Megadeth energy
Interesting.
to
Yeah.
that, and they put out some good stuff. Then there's Malice. I would say they're a good one. Um, and then we get all these bands that are recognizably thrash bands. So here's where we can talk about Overkill,
Overkill. Yeah.
Exodus, I would say too, Metal Church. They're all called or not power, they're all called speed metal bands, but they all become thrash. The big four all fit in there. Ken says, I would argue that Anthrax very quickly became thrash based on their lyrical content. Oh,
That's
that's
a really good, that's an interesting point.
yeah. Um, I mean, if we think about Spreading the Disease, what are the big lyrical themes? Madhouse, I'm going crazy. That's big in thrash stuff.
Right.
Um, uh, what's the one? Oh, the Gunslinger, right? Sort of live or die situations. That's common. They got that song Medusa. Um, yeah, I could see that. You know,
That's we didn't discuss the lyric content. It's a good point.
yeah.
As a factor, I mean.
What's that?
As a factor, I meant.
Yeah, so I think we really have to explore more. Maybe there's no neat dividing line between speed and thrash because so many bands morph from one to the other.
Yeah.
But so here's where we got to tap Scott. Um, if you were going to pick out like musical elements or aspects how would you say they're not fundamentally different from each other? How can we distinguish between them?
Between power and speed, or power and
Between
thrash?
speed and thrash, as
See,
bands are moving.
I always thought that thrash metal was I would say speed metal. Let's do it backwards. Speed metal is a cleaner version of thrash metal.
Okay.
I think thrash got like a even more aggressive in my mind. Like if you said speed metal, that evoked something, but if you said thrash metal, that was a little more what's the word I'm looking? Well, not sloppy in any way.
Yeah, it's precise, crunchy.
Uh,
Uh,
more over the top, more
okay.
more metal. The speed metal with the add more metal.
I mean, we're basically now like, let's
We
turn it
got
up
it
to
out.
11. Except now we'll turn it up to 12.
No, exactly. We yeah, that was 40 years old. The 11.
So Rob brings up, I understood both power metal and thrash metal as different branchings from speed metal. And that's right.
Yeah,
And so if we're going to say that thrash becomes harsher, maybe that's the term, harsher.
for sure.
You
Yeah, that's a
know,
good word.
um, power is going to become less so, but it's still going to maintain speed, and it becomes more melodic, I would say.
Yeah, it maintains the intensity, I think.
Okay, yeah.
You
That's a
know,
good distinguisher.
yeah. Um, yeah. I mean, there's definitely when you hear it. Oh, well, there's another one, but yeah, I think we do name these things. We would listen to the same thing and probably name it the same thing. And I think that's what we're kind of going by. Like thrash to me was always like a lot more aggressive or a lot more.
Yeah.
Um,
As I was thinking about it in terms of bass stuff, I want to say that so there isn't like a neat dividing line between speed and thrash, but I will say that I think you can say that the bass lines are a little bit more coordinated with the riff. It's very common in thrash stuff
yeah,
to have like the rhythm
yeah,
guitar and the bass are essentially doing the same thing. Or, Cliff Burton was great at doing this. It's pedal notes. It's you've
yeah.
got the low E, and then you're doing the rest of the riff, alternating between that to give it the heaviness. I think that's kind of like, I mean, we could call that a trope, maybe even, of thrash
Mm,
music.
yeah. No, yeah, I would agree. The doubling of the riff.
Yeah. Do you
With
think is there a difference between the drumming in speed and thrash?
oh,
I'm not
I mean,
very good at distinguishing that kind of stuff.
the only thing I could think of is more ringing cymbals in thrash.
Okay.
You know, as something I would kind of visualize in my mind first. Thrash is more. I mean, the term implies kind of that more, even though the music's very tight. It's
Yeah.
well. I'll just make it easy. It's noisier.
Yeah. Would you say that the soloing in, if we're using these very broad categories, but the soloing in thrash is different than the soloing in speed metal, like more oriented towards, chromatic scales or stuff like that, or
I I think I don't know if I had to generalize it.
yeah,
Um, Speed metal is a lot of the notes, very precise. I think thrash you can you can get away with more bends, more tremolo bar stuff, more a different kind of sonic noise.
okay,
Like if you think, like Kirk Hammett wasn't really a speed metal guitar. I would say he was a thrash guitar player.
yeah,
Back in the day. It was I always love this adjective. His soloing was irresponsible.
Now,
But
what does that mean? It's just like let's try this out, or
yeah, just this is fine. I'm just gonna make some noise. I'm gonna go for. Um, I'm not worried about if this one's in tune. I don't not worry, but it's not a knock. It's he's one of the pioneers, and then
yeah.
when you hear that, it's kind of like the thrash. Well, he's kind of the he kind of becomes the benchmark of my uncle used to say when I was little, when I listened to a style of music, copy the greats even if you think it's wrong. And that always rang out to me like, oh, because it's like, oh, I'm not going to listen to the Temptations. That's before they knew how to play guitar. That's just remedial. And he
Oh,
said, no.
interesting.
He said, no, you learn it as it is, because even if you think it's wrong, and so that's why I've always carried that with me for as far as genres. Like,
Yeah,
oh, that
yeah,
guy was terrible. Well, he was doing something right because he's in the biggest thrash metal band in the world, you know.
yeah. What
So
about? I mean, so actually, let's take Rob's question here. Is Slayer too thrash metal to be considered speed metal? I mean, you get the idea that they are merging out of a context that includes speed metal, but they like very early on they're like, we're going to be faster than everybody else. And it's funny too, because Dave Mustaine, when he leaves Metallica, he says we're going to be heavier than
that's
Metallica,
right.
right? He doesn't say we're going to be faster than Metallica. Slayer is like, let's speed it up as much as we can. But I don't know. Uh First album, is it thrash or is it speed? I would say it's already thrash, wouldn't you?
I always think of Slayer as a thrash band. Yeah.
If they brought it out 2 years earlier, it would have been called speed though, right?
You mean before we had thrash? Or I don't know.
Yeah.
Would it, yeah, we might call it speed metal.
Well, we wouldn't we definitely wouldn't call it glam, or something like that.
Yeah, it's pretty it's full of yeah, speed and heaviness.
Yeah.
Um it's almost in a good way, it's almost hyperbolic, the way that you
Oh,
know
yeah, that's an interesting way to think about it. So when people talk about being hyperbolic, they mean like going beyond. So like something happens, you're like, this is amazing, this is the best thing in the world, and other people are like, yeah, this is great, but I don't know that it's like, number one, you're being hyperbolic, right? And you could look at both speed metal in its time and then thrash metal after it as hyperbolizations of a set of things that work within heavy metal, and you're trying to do them better, more intense, bringing more to the table. Not that there's anything wrong with the stuff that you had before,
right.
but there's a possibility of doing something that's not it's not radically new because it's within a continuity, right? But you're changing it. And you think about, we've talked about this before in the past, the technology,
Right.
the capacity to produce distortion in the 1980s, very different than overdriving in the 1970s. Like, I remember when I was listening to, so my introduction to Judas Priest was Defenders of the Faith, arguably one of their heaviest albums ever. Some people say that Painkiller is heavier, and it is super heavy, but it's in a different way than Defenders of the Faith.
Yeah, right.
So then I got Sin After Sin, and same singer. Okay, so that's recognizable, but the guitars sounded so different, and I was like, I like this, but what's going on with this? Where's the, like wall of sound, distorted stuff that I'm used to hearing? Why is it like this? And of course, I was a kid, so I didn't have any idea at the time that in the 1970s, they didn't really have that technology. And I think that as we're moving into speed and we're moving into thrash, then we're getting, you know, you can exploit uh, technological capacities that you couldn't before, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like heads are gonna roll. That doubled guitar intro is so satisfying,
Yeah, yeah.
and that's from Defenders of the Faith,
That
right?
is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, so I have it right. Yeah. So I did I say that wrong? No. But
That's the
like that,
first track, I think, isn't it?
that's such a heavy, heavy.
Yeah.
I and I know what you mean because it's if you put headphones on, there's a guitar in each ear, and they're playing the same thing pretty much, and but it was like like you said, like a wall of sound heaviness. Two Marshall amps, one in each ear with a different player. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. So, Ken, coming back to Slayer, according to Tom Araya, that was entirely the point. They set out to frighten people with their faster style and lyrical content, focusing on the apocalypse serial killers. Yeah, they had to clarify that because people are like, "Are you really a satanic band? You know, are you worshiping Satan?" And they're like, "No, no, it's just this is musical content, man. You know,
Right.
this is art." Um, but yeah, I think the faster style. It's interesting because you reach a point of diminishing returns. If it gets too fast,
Right.
now it sounds like a caricature. You know. Um,
Well, it's Napalm Death.
okay.
Like that got where it was 132 songs on an album, I think,
Yeah.
and it was like they would some songs beat a second. That was I think that's where that's all. If that's not comedy, it's definitely diminishing returns. I
Yeah.
remember my friend buying that album, being really into it. Must have been the early '90s. I forgot what it was called.
I mean, a band that did that in a funny way, and now this is much earlier, would be SOD, you know,
Oh, right,
Sergeant D and the SOD. They have like 20 songs on the album, I think, because they're all
right,
like, a minute and a half long,
right. Yeah, yeah.
you know.
What was the other band? Sore Throat. That was
Oh,
another
I
one.
don't
Like,
know them.
oh, it's the same thing. It's diminishing returns. It's like Napalm Death. It's
Okay.
where it's like we're gonna outdo Slayer.
I was talking with Mark about this the other day. With Metallica's progression, you've got these three really great albums that Cliff Burton is able to be on, and you can say that from Kill 'Em All to Ride the Lightning and Master of Puppets. There's a transition going on, and then and Justice for All, I think, reaches a kind of, at least for that band, like a pinnacle of heaviness, crunchiness. It's like taking things up to a higher level. They also, mix the bass out, which is unfortunate but understandable because it's no longer Cliff Burton, but just a
Right.
hired hand, right? Who couldn't really put up much resistance. And then where would they go from that? So, the Black Album, because you can't actually make it much heavier than that, right?
Right.
If you're going on a trajectory, you got to go somewhere else with it.
That's an interesting point because that was the album that disappointed most of us.
Well, no,
Um,
I think most of you and me and people we
yeah, that's
know.
what I mean.
I mean, it was the one that put them on the map, and I think part of why we were disappointed is all these nerds were now into the band that we loved for their sheer aggression.
Well, what was it? The really was comical or and angering was it the video to Nothing Else Matters where they're like in ponytails with glasses, like with music stands in front of them in the studio.
Could be, yeah.
I'm going, Metallica can't read music. And who wrote that?
Yeah.
It was definitely one of those. This is our stuff. This is our music.
Yeah.
It was a tough thing for metalheads.
Yeah, and I think that so it wasn't just that they put out these great um thrash albums and were like, you see them in concert and they were just really, really rocking. They also, were doing covers of great new wave of British heavy metal stuff, going
Yeah.
even further back into Budgie, and you're like, yeah, these guys they're committed. They are part of a movement. And then the Black Album comes out, and you're like, well, what is this? So,
Yep.
um, Now, Andrew has a thought here. Speed metal inhabits a time we can call forward thrust, speed, acceleration, eruption. It seems to try to outrun finitude, temporal, vulnerable, and incomplete beings. Compare the opposite, doom metal, slowing things down, swelling and protracted time, repetition, slowness, decay. Doom metal seems to draw out finitude by drawing it out almost painfully slow. So, if speed metal expresses meaning through acceleration, can doom metal be said to express meaning through suspension? Yeah, this is a really interesting juxtaposition because they're both heavy um,
Right.
genres. So neither of them are light. Sometimes we used to make fun of glam metal by calling it light metal with an LITE.
Right.
Both of these are like authentically heavy metal, but they are kind of going in opposite directions. And it's not just that doom metal is just didn't get fast. It's deliberately slowing things down. That's where the Sabbath stuff is like really,
Well,
really influential.
well, the song Black Sabbath.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just dun, dun, dun. It's like that's
Yeah.
really slow, and that's doom.
Yeah.
That's what doom
So
sounds.
yeah, I think that works. And then, thrash coming out of speed kind of is leaving that behind and becoming its own thing. Um,
Oh yeah, definitely.
yeah. I will say too that some of these speed metal bands, so the majority of them, you could say, at least in America, are transitioning to thrash. In Germany, it seems to be power. Some of them are already black metal bands, like Venom is, right? Um, and some of the other ones are essentially like reverting back to classic heavy metal, like Accept does.
Right. Yeah.
So, here's a question that we should raise. If a band wants to call itself speed metal today, what are they really saying about themselves? Is it that there was a blueprint from, say, 81 to 85 of a certain sound and they're imitating that? Um, is there really something to go back to, or was it something that was always how did you put it earlier, Scott? Like you're always like kind of like almost falling forward. There wasn't an equilibrium to it.
Well, it was just really on edge. Like the time
On
is really
edge.
stiff, and it's very stiff and on edge. But
Okay.
that's part of the tightness of it. Um,
Yeah.
I think it's when you have these bands that that come out now that you kind of compare to. Well, last time I compared one of the bands we were listening to um, Thin Lizzy meets very early Saxon, and it was kind of a throwback sound. And I guess if you use the word speed metal, it is a nostalgic term at this point. It is a time and place, like you say, because right now, I mean, there's so many. Every band has like 3 sentences to call what they are, and it's basically they can make up anything.
Yeah, yeah.
Like math. Well, math metal is one that I know a band goes by, but that's a short version of like a lot of them. But so say something like that. That would be like I would be expecting more of a throwback to that era.
So maybe speed metal is being used again in the present in a more evocative rather than precise way, just as it was back in the day.
But well, yeah,
Okay.
I think if you and I got together, so we're going to do speed metal, we would be taking out the old records. I think to
Yeah.
listen, because that's
Well, we'd probably be doing covers.
well,
We'd
or
probably,
yeah, or making the stuff production wise and everything sound like what it did in '84 and '85.
boy, that's an interesting uh thing to think about. There you can get like filters here. I want to sound like, thrash
Oh,
metal. I want to sound like this. Is there something like that for speed metal to make your
I mean,
guitar, I don't know, like a distinctive speed metal, I
yeah,
don't
I mean,
know,
I would get
equalizer or whatever?
I'd get a JCM 800, like the ones that they had in the early 80s that they were using then. And I would if it was something I was going for, I would imitate the sound and the basic sentiment of that music. I wouldn't be inventing anything new. I'd be writing my original music, but with a blueprint, as you say, of the stuff from that era.
Okay.
And people do it all the time. People will come back and do things that are nostalgic. It's like, well, this sounds like it's from the 60s. This sounds like it's arena rock 70s.
Yeah. There was that period, I guess you could say, from the 90s to the early aughts, where there were a lot of bands that were trying to sound retro, throwback, 60s, 70s. And sometimes it would work and sometimes it just wouldn't.
Right. Yeah, it's tricky to do. I mean, it would have to be a bunch of people that were heavily influenced by specific albums
Yeah.
in metal or in any genre, really. People write Beatle pop all the time still right now. Something that sounds like something the Beatles, or it's like post Beatles.
Huh.
You could do that you could go back and imitate, and it wouldn't be too hard to duplicate the sound and all that.
Yeah.
I mean, the actual technological part of it.
So to go to Rob's question, are there any new speed metal bands that has formed in this century? Which now is 25 years, so we got a good long thing. Yeah, there are bands out there that are calling themselves speed metal. I haven't actually listened to any of them.
I haven't. No, it didn't occur to me that I feel like that term kind of died. Like people say heavy metal bands
Yeah.
these days, but if they're more like,
but it's funny because it's part of the metal genre, right?
Wow.
With the word clipped off, and it typically means mostly the stuff from the 80s, some 70s.
Exactly.
It's often like synonymous with traditional metal. So
Yeah.
so Ken has an answer. A lot of modern traditional or new wave of British heavy metal bands are faster than the old bands and could legitimately be considered to be speed metal. I mean, I'm unconvinced about that. So, like, take Raven for example. Okay, so they were a speed metal band. They've never stopped producing albums and touring, and their more recent stuff is, it's using the capacities of the technology and kind of responding to like a couple trends over the last 30 years. It's arguably heavier and fuller than the stuff that they had before. I would say they weren't a speed metal band, but they were definitely a heavy metal band. Saxon, same story. They've never stopped touring, never stopped putting out albums. I want to say they've got like 20 now at this point. And Thunderbolt, Nosferatu, those are really, you take those and you put them up against like Wheels of Steel or Strong Arm of the Law, and these are really, really heavy, but they're not, and they are faster, but it's not like the speed metal from the 80s. So it's not just enough to be fast and heavy, I think.
Right. There's a band at Berkeley that they have what's called you can apply to have a professor rehearse your band 2 hours a week. It's called directed study, and
Okay.
I have this band, and I tried this out on them. A lot of unison, like really, I would call them speed math metal, right? Speed metal,
Okay.
very fast, but like parts that don't necessarily repeat and are more mathematical, but extremely tight. And I said, so you guys are kind of like you guys a speed metal band? Just to try it out, and they looked at me like I had 6 heads. So, I mean, I thought I would try it out, saying I think this would qualify for a speed metal, at least some category of it.
Well, did they
But
have any idea what you were referencing though, or?
well, that's the point. Yeah, that's it's an obsolete word, or
Okay. So yeah, so this kind of goes to Andrews, is speed metal best understood as a transitional style rather than a fully formed genre? I think that's a good way to talk about it. Transitional style. I was using the word
Great.
movement, which I don't think is the right word. I also said quasi genre, which I think works, but
Right.
style or maybe that's the best descriptor. And I think it was transitional. And I think that's part of why it's not a useful referent for younger musicians who don't have that background. We geek out about it because we lived through it and we remember it happening. They don't have things to peg it to.
Although, before I was born, there was lots of different kinds of, there's a difference between rockabilly and country and all this stuff with the
Yeah.
50s. And I could talk about all that stuff. I don't know if there's just not a desire to have any roots in where their music comes from.
But
Whereas,
rockabilly and country both like survived for decades as genres of music. And in the case of country, it's like a whole basket of
oh,
genres, I think you could say.
yeah, country, yeah, but I mean, there was a difference between rockabilly, like the Elvis stuff,
Yeah. But
and
there's still people doing rockabilly today.
yeah, it's a subculture for sure.
Yeah.
But that's true. I mean, but I guess my point is that music wasn't really on the radio or anything, but I was aware of what happened before me.
Okay.
And for whatever reason, it's not that I went to the library and studied it. I think there was this just goes back to this more of a community, and you heard other people speak about different kinds of music, or something came on TV, which people have Netflix now. They don't have TV where it exposes them to different kind of stuff. Or like,
what we lack is a unifying like body of discourse, you could say.
And there's always a good argument, Ken can attest to this, growing up in England, I always heard the BBC, you'd hear rock for an hour and then you hear classical pieces, and then you were exposed to a lot of different music growing up in the UK because of, those radio stations that you would hear so much different music. That it wasn't weird if you knew classical composers, even though you're a metalhead.
Yeah.
But,
Although, you could also just like turn it off. I don't want to hear this crap.
well, that's what we would have done.
So Rob says technical death metal might be a successor.
Technical death metal.
I'm sure that exists, or I don't know. I mean, death metal is its own huge genre. Venom is, a speed metal, or not. They're not a death metal band. There are some death metal bands that were connected with speed metal. But I mean, are they doing speed metal at this point? I don't know.
I mean, we might say it has the elements or the ingredients of speed metal, but they might go, "What are you talking about, Grandpa?" Oh, Ken, yeah, that's how I understood it. So yeah, so that's being exposed to a lot of different things, and even if you weren't into Bach, say for example, you were aware and could discuss Bach, even if you weren't listening to or you didn't like it. You could definitely discuss, like, because you've heard, you knew what you were listening to.
Yeah, I mean, we would hear a lot of stuff like riding in other people's cars. Either it was like playing on a tape or they were listening to the radio, and yeah.
Or just what my dad listened to, right? Or people's parents listened to. That was another one, that the tape in the car.
Yeah. So here's a good place for us to bring this to a close. Rob has a suggestion. Maybe speed metal has gone the way of vital humors, and the old 4-element theories, and the body having 4 humors. You could be choleric or phlegmatic or sanguine, or what's the other one? Melancholic. Yeah, we don't use those sort of designators anymore.
Oh, interesting. I didn't even know what that was.
Maybe it has kind of. I mean,
Yeah,
it
wow,
certainly
that's a good one.
was an interesting time and a lot of interesting bands that we can still listen to and appreciate, and we can say that is speed metal. But
Right.
yeah, I don't think it's I don't see it as a living thing, you know.
Melodic vocals with bass structure. Solos, dedicated scenes. So I'm reading what Andrew just wrote. Features being genre specific traits, high BPM, beats per minute, melodic vocals, riff bass structure. Yes, definitely. Raw production. That's a
Yeah,
good one. The raw
yeah,
production, elaborate solos, dedicated scenes, and the continued influence. The genre maybe just needs recognizable form and repetition. Um, yeah, I do like the raw production. We touched on that earlier.
I
Um,
mean, we can talk about genres as no longer living genres, certainly, right? And somebody could resuscitate them if they wanted to, I guess.
that's where I was getting at with the speed metal. If you were going to call it speed metal, you'd have to go through that era where where it existed. So
Yeah. Well, I think this is a fitting place to bring it to a close. So we'll thank everybody for joining and all the great comments and suggestions. And glad you could be here with us. As usual, Scott, I'll give you the last word on uh, whatever you want to say.
yeah, this was one of the ones I researched more than any of the other ones. I do know a lot of the bands, but I think I wasn't a big thrash or speed metal listener. I was aware of it specifically the reasons we talked about. My friends would listen to it, or I'd hear it a lot in a friend's car, or I'd hear. I mean, Anthrax was one of the groups I listened to. I liked Venom, but to actually go and say to myself, now I remember naming things like metallic. I remember using these terms. Would I use them for this specific thing? Like
Yeah.
that was on the list. And I really kind of kicked them around and thought about it. So it was really enjoyable topic for me. I definitely, cut my teeth on these were harder things to define.